Well, let's jump into de Tolly. He was born to a German-speaking noble family in Latvia, and oddly enough, his ancestors were Scottish. And his father served in the Russian army. That's that's a lot of different nationalities going on right there. Sounds like his family at least was a real worldly family.
Yes, and I think it's not surprising because this is the kind of reality of the early modern Russian Empire, or where the Russian rulers, starting with Peter the Great, and even before, but especially with Peter the Great, actively solicited foreign, I'll put experts, so to speak, or specialists, in order to help them modernize Russian military, Russian state. And one of the individuals who ultimately will end up serving in Russian state will be Barclay de Tolly. And so Barclay de Tolly was born in December of 1761 in modern day Riga, but he grew up actually in St. Petersburg, and that's kind of the reflection of his father, right, making a crucial decision of entering Russian service.
But they were German speaking though at home, correct?
Yes, and he reflects again, even though the family is originally from Aberdeenshire or Aberdeenshire, I guess, in Scotland. By the time Barclay de Tolly comes around in 18th century, mid 18th century, the family has largely lost its Scottish identity and has become more of a Livonian identity, and therefore it is German speaking, and I think it's appropriate to classify them as part of the Livonian German elite. And indeed, one of the issues that Barclay de Tolly will be confronted with later on and throughout his really service in the army is perception that he was not a quotation kind of marks Russian, but rather a foreigner, a German. And the fact that he spoke German fluently and Russian kind of broken language only helped that perception.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I was reading up on him. Looks like two of his brothers also served in the army.
Yeah, and then it's again a reality that for an elite, for children of the elite in Russian Empire, there were very few outlets for their talents and skills, and that's I think I discussed that especially in detail in the biography of Kutuzov, because Kutuzov is in the same kind of experiences as Barclay de Tolly, that as a son of a nobleman, you can't, for example, indulge yourself in being a professional writer or a poet or an artist. You can't really pursue a legal career or a career in some other sphere. Your career is predetermined in the sense that you will be in a service to the state, and that will be either a diplomatic career in a foreign service, or it will be, as most cases, a military career.
Okay.
So, for Kutuzov and for Barclay de Tolly, I think their careers are predestined in that they were in the ranks of Russian nobility, and they had to join the military to really further their careers.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like he, moving on the story, he joins looks like a Carbineer regiment in 1776, and from there, looks like he works his way up slowly in the ranks.
Yes, and steadily. I think slowly but steadily. And of course, both Kutuzov and Barclay de Tolly will be serving in the Russo-Turkish or Russo-Ottoman Wars in early 1790s, where Barclay de Tolly distinguished himself in the siege and capture of Ochakov, the great Ottoman fortress in the Crimea, where Kutuzov was actually wounded. And Barclay de Tolly distinguished himself to the degree that he was actually introduced to the Gregory Potemkin, right, the one-time lover of Empress Catherine, but now, in many respects, the architects of the Russian imperial expansion. And Potemkin personally congratulates and rewards Barclay de Tolly. So here you have kind of a budding officer. But he didn't stay in the Crimea for long. In fact, shortly after the capture of Ochakov, and there is a second kind of storming at Ackerman, Barclay de Tolly sent to a different front because at the same time the Russians were fighting not just the Turks but also the Swedes.
Right.
And so he sent to the Baltic frontier in 1789, but it was, shall I say, uneventful, right? So the fighting was limited, but Barclay de Tolly was involved in action against the Swedes.
Right.
It's worth mentioning it because later on, of course, in 1808, 1809, he will really kind of extol and really rise as a prominent commander by fighting Swedes in Finland.
Right. And even after that, in the Polish campaign, I think it's interesting that he's becoming familiar with this territory. He's starting to know it really well because he's on so many fronts.
Yes, absolutely. And these are kind of the service against the Ottomans, and then the Swedes are his baptisms by fire. So this is where kind of his mindset of what makes a good officer, his experiences, that will shape his later on decisions will all be forged. And after the Russo-Swedish War ends in 1790, he continues service and then participates in the Polish partitions that Russia engineered in 1790. And he indeed distinguished himself in the capture of the nowadays Lithuanian capital city of Vilnius. Back then it's Vilna. So he is an active participant in the Russian imperial aggrandizement along the many kind of the great officers of his generation.
Right.
And by the end of this third partition, Barclay de Tolly will be already a lieutenant colonel. So he's already risen from being a cornet, which is kind of a basic rank in the army, from cornet in 1778 to lieutenant colonel in 1794, which is
pretty good.
It's a decent record.
6 years. Yeah. And then I was reading he's an aide-de-camp to several major officers, so he's learning this whole time, and like you said, he's also serving at the front. So baptism by fire, and then it looks like from there he gets promoted again. Looks like 1799 to a major general.
Yes, he is promoted in 1799, and actually this is, again, remember, this is the period of Pauline, Emperor Paul's reforms, transformations, and part of it, Paul came to power, by the way, in 1796 in November. And as part of the reforms that Paul introduced was the reform to purge the army of superfluous officers, so kind of dead weight. So, and this is where the perception of Paul being this mad czar who did a lot of foolish things is misplaced, because some of the reforms that Paul did were actually needed and kind of institutionally important. And Barclay de Tolly benefits from it. And then the promotion to Major General that you referred to in March of 1799 is actually as a result of an inspection that shows that his regiment is among the best maintained, best managed in the army, which is important considering what the Russia is doing at the time. So think about this. 1799 is the period when Russia is involved in the war of the Second Coalition, right? And you have Suvorov commanding Russian army in Italy. You have the likes of Peter Bagration and Mikhail Miloradovich, these bright names that will come out of that campaign, right? By the time they came back, Bagration and Miloradovich was on the lips of everyone in Russia. Barclay de Tolly, by comparison, was not involved in that campaign, and therefore he missed that chance to shine.
Yeah, and jumping ahead, he wasn't at Austerlitz either, was he?
Again, that's right. When the war began, this is the war of the Third Coalition between Russia and Austria on one side and France on the other. We know that Russia mobilized well over 100,000 men, which were grouped in several armies. One army was the army that Kutuzov commanded, that was sent to Bavaria to support the main Austrian thrust against Napoleon. But in addition to that, there was a second army to the north that was commanded by Benningsen. And Barclay de Tolly commanded a brigade in Benningsen's army, which meant that Benningsen's was never part of that massive kind of campaign that took place in Bavaria and then Austria that culminated in the Russian defeat at Austerlitz. So, so once again, maybe it was a good thing for Barclay that he missed certainly Austerlitz, but he also missed out on an opportunity to shine during the Russian retreat from Braunau in Bavaria to Austerlitz. Because during that retreat, which will become kind of a shining page in the Russian military history, once again, Bagration, Miloradovich, and others distinguished themselves at places like Amstetten or at Hollabrunn, Schongraben. Of course, that famous stand that Bagration did by holding off the advance guard of Murat and Lannes, and sacrificing much of his force but saving the army. I mean, this is a scene that Tolstoy will later on immortalize, right? Well, Barclay de Tolly is not present there, and therefore he's once again misses out.
So his first real meeting with Napoleon, I believe, was the Battle of Pultusk in December of 1806. And I've read about this battle several times, and it seems like it was just kind of a mess. Like nobody's even sure who won that battle.
Yes. So technically it's not even his first encounter with Napoleon, because Napoleon, of course, did not personally command the units at Pultusk. But Barclay de Tolly was indeed present in this battle at Pultusk, and it is a slugfest. It's of course fought in late December. I don't know if you've traveled to Eastern Europe in late December, especially in Poland, but it's not pretty. It's cold. It's of course snowy, and the presence of these two massive armies denuded the countryside of whatever was there.
Provisions. I have a great quote from Marbeau. It rained and snowed incessantly. Provisions became scarce. No more wine, hardly any beer. And what there was exceedingly bad. No bread, and quarters for which we had to fight the pigs and the cows. End quote. And Bennigsen was on the scene as well. Did the two men get along, de Tolly and Bennigsen?
Well, at this time, Bennigsen is the commander in chief, or at least the commander of the corps. He will be soon enough commander in chief. And Barclay de Tolly is one of the commanders under him, so he has no choice but to get along with him. And the battle will be fought on December 26. You'll have kind of about 35,000 Russians against about 27,000 French, and Russians will stay more on defensive. The French will keep attacking, and Barclay de Tolly is among the first to bear the brunt of these attacks. He commanded the forward elements of the Bennigsen's corps, and he fought the French at Sochochin, at Kolozomb, and then at Pultusk he essentially held one of the positions, and successfully so, since the continued attacks of Marshal Lannes all resulted in the French units being driven back, and ultimately the Russians could claim victory because they held to the positions. But the French, of course, didn't claim the victory, because ultimately later that night Bennigsen decided to retreat from the battlefield, and hence left the battlefield in the French hands.
And from there, 3 months later, another slugfest that de Tolly was involved in, which is the Battle of Eylau.
Yes, but I do want to mention one important element. This is where the making of Barclay de Tolly as a commander in chief is that from retreat from Pultusk to Eylau, Barclay de Tolly was in charge of the rear guard, or at least one of the elements of rear guard, since the main rear guard was under command of the Bagration. And it is Barclay de Tolly who distinguished himself at the really heated action at Hof on the eve of Eylau. And he kind of, despite being in a really bad position and his troops fatigued and lacking the basic essentials, Barclay de Tolly was able to hold off the French for much of the day. And I think this is where you kind of see his star slowly rising above the horizon. The actions at Pultusk and then Hof bring attention to him. Bagration writes effusively about Barclay de Tolly as a capable tactical commander.
Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere, and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I've really enjoyed the ease of use and the distribution ability of this platform.
This point becomes important in light of what Barclay de Tolly will do in 1812.
Right.
Which will be effectively pursue this asymmetrical, protracted, right, defensive war against Napoleon. And so the question then becomes, was it something that he's been thinking of since 1807? Or is it, the events of 1812 is simply the sheer reality of him being unable to stop a grand army of more than 500,000 men, right? So this is where we get really an interesting discussion, how much of it was caused by reality, how much was it a careful planning on Barclay's part.
Okay. And he gets promoted to lieutenant general.
He is so there is I think an important point there. He's promoted to lieutenant general for his performance in the campaign as such. So in fact, in addition to lieutenant general, he's given the orders of St. George and Vladimir and Anna. So this is kind of recognition that is coming his way. He is also, which is no less important, is elevated in terms of command. He's given command of an entire division, the 6th Infantry Division. But there is a one incident in his kind of career that is at this time. So when he was injured at Eylau, he was at a hospital and he was recuperating. And there he had a meeting with a German officer, and the German officer later on wrote down in his kind of writings, in his memoirs, that while conversing with Barclay de Tolly, Barclay complained about the overall strategy that the Russian high command was pursuing against Napoleon, and it said we should not. In essentially, Barclay tells him that we should not be pursuing this offensive kind of go out and engage Napoleon, but rather we need to fight a protracted asymmetrical warfare against the French. The goal would be to draw the enemy further away from his operational bases,
right,
to exhaust him through raids and kind of asymmetrical attacks, and then ultimately wait for a moment when his forces are weak, kind of depleted through strategic attrition and so on. And then we can strike back.
I think that's an important point, that you can win a war without winning battles. And, George Washington did that during the American Revolution. He first couple of battles he lost, but he always kept, an army in the field to keep the pressure on the British.
Yes.
So I think de Tolly has a great point there, to, weaken Napoleon, draw him further away from his supply bases, and then win the war over the long haul.
Yeah, and this becomes particularly interesting. By the end of the 1807, there is already rumors of a war between Russia and Sweden, and of course that is the consequence of the famous meeting between Emperor Alexander and Napoleon at Tilsit. And in the Treaty of Tilsit, as we know, the two emperors effectively partitioned Europe into two spheres of influence, and Alex receives assurance, Napoleon's assurance, that he has kind of free hand in Scandinavia, or at least in the eastern part of it. And he decides to exploit this opportunity to grab Finland. Of course, Finland at the time was part of Sweden,
right.
which entails an all-out war with Sweden. And so the war begins in early 1808, and Barclay de Tolly, as a division commander, is actually assigned to the separate expeditionary corps that was sent to invade Finland. So he's leading one of these divisions along with Bagration, fellow, again, a rival and a fellow commander. And Barclay de Tolly's actions in 1808, 1809 during this Russo-Swedish War is, I think, are good examples of what he's capable of as the tactical operational commander. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because this is essentially the only time where he can be on, at least on operational level, a commander of his own, because later on in 1812, right, his hands are hammered by, well,
right.
You know,
so it's his first real independent command.
I would say so, even though there is, he's part of a corps, and he needs to take and follow the overall plan, but as a divisional commander, he has a bigger freedom to act. And he is, he is the one in responsible for occupying the province of Savolax and the city of Kuopio in central Finland. He is the one who organizes defense of Kuopio in late 1808 and successfully repels 2 Swedish offensives. Then he kind of gets sick, and for a while he has to leave. But he comes back in early 1809, and he's given a command of a so-called Vasa Corps, and this Vasa Corps is responsible for attempting for a remarkable operation. In early 1809, the Russian command decides to attempt an audacious expedition. They need to bring Sweden to its knees, right? They want to knock Sweden out of war, and so Emperor Alexander of Russia approves a 3-pronged attack against Sweden from Finland. One will be to depart from Turku to the Åland Islands and then straight to Stockholm. This is across the kind of semi-frozen Gulf. The second one will be from middle of Gulf of Bosnia, from the city of Vasa, and that's where Barclay de Tolly is, from Vasa to Umeå to strike central Swedish provinces. And the third corps will be sent essentially on a roundabout around the northern parts of Bosnia. Now, the most challenging part of this expedition is the crossing of Bosnia from Vasa to Umeå, because there is the kind of the open space of nothing but ice.
Right.
And this is where Barclay de Tolly commands. And so in March of 1809, this Vasa Corps with Barclay de Tolly leading it makes the crossing of the so-called Kvarken and carries the cavalry, artillery, successfully makes it across, reaches Swedish mainland and captures the city of Umeå, which forces Swedes to negotiate. So I think that's a great exploit. I couldn't resist not mentioning it.
All right. No, it sounds like he had like a kind of a mini Austerlitz there, like a surprise.
And that's why in April of 1809, he's then promoted to the rank of the full general of infantry. So this is a great exploit.
Okay. I'm glad you told us that. I did not know that story. So that's,
and this is where I think the paths of Bagration and Barclay de Tolly kind of diverge once more. And we've talked already. The Bagration had advantage of fighting in the War of Second Coalition in Italy, then Third Coalition, and leading up to Austerlitz. And now here, Barclay de Tolly, even though he participates in the war, and Bagration is fighting too. In fact, he's the one who's leading the crossing of the Bosnia Gulf to Stockholm. But after the war, Bagration is sent to fight the Turks, and he's given actually the command of the Russian army, while Barclay de Tolly is capped in Finland, and his command is appointed as a governor general of Finland. And so the reason I want to emphasize this is because here you already see Emperor Alexander, and especially his advisor, Alexei Arakcheyev, who will be war minister and a kind of a crucial figure in Russian military circles, them appreciating Barclay de Tolly not only as a tactical and operational commander, which they certainly did for Bagration, but they appreciate now Barclay de Tolly's administrative kind of management skills, which I think Bagration lacked.
From there, though, and I want to tell the story almost backwards, because in 1812, after Napoleon was driven from Russia, he became somewhat of a hero, and his popularity soared, and his honor was made public by the Tsar. But I wanted to start with that because at the beginning of Napoleon's invasion, it was the opposite, right? Like he was reviled by the court and everyone. Like, what are you doing? And we talked about this in the Kutuzov episode. Like, why are you retiring in front of this massive invasion of Napoleon?
Yes, the strategy that Barclay de Tolly pursues is very unpopular. It is unpopular on two key points. One, because who advocates it? That upstart, right? This non-Russian, German-speaking upstart who is talking about retreat.
Right.
Barclay de Tolly, and then this is again goes back to the down to personality issue. Barclay de Tolly never fully embraced Russian culture. He never kind of developed the fluency in Russian.
Right.
He always preferred to speak German.
Right.
He remained Lutheran rather than Orthodox. He had this notorious aloof demeanor, which earned him very few friends. And even those who were his friends, even those who praised his honesty, straightforward character, who talked about his hard work and dedication, also could not kind of resist but talk about, and this is a quote, of his heavy German character, right? That kind of German aloofness, that's stereotypical.
Yeah.
They talked about a quote, a German soul, and not in a good way,
right?
Because they spoke about this German soul, quote, blending conceit with brusqueness. And that and this is a man, remind you, this is friends who talk about him, right?
Right.
And so I think when you deal with the personality of a commander-in-chief or a prominent figure, and that figure is not likable, then it makes it even harder for you to embrace what he has to kind of tell you, what he has to sell, what he has to order you. So that's one point. And the second is this. If you look at the 18th century, right, and you look at the Russian military performance, they won a war against Persia in 1720s, against the Ottomans in 1730s. They scored success against the Swedes in 1740s. They certainly considered that they won 7 Years' War, if not for that darn Peter III, right, who cut the deal with the Prussians.
Right.
They won the War of the Bar Confederation, which was part of the first partition of Poland.
Yep.
They won the Russo-Ottoman War in 1760s and 70s. They won the second Russo-Ottoman War in 1780s and 1790s. They won the war with Sweden in 1790. Then they crushed the Poles again in 1792. Then they defeated the Persians again in 1796. Then they fought in the war against the French, and guess what? Suvorov is undefeated, right? In that sense, against the French. They can always point to Trebia and Novi, and the ultimate kind of setback, the fact that the French ultimately won in this war, Russians did not ascribe to themselves, but rather to the Austrians and the British. Remember, ultimately the French won because the Russia withdrew from the war over the coalition difficulties. And then the War of the Third Coalition, that's the first major defeat, and that's where kind of really the realization is that the Russians can be indeed defeated. But even then, the blame is on Austrians. In Kutuzov book, I go into depth kind of discussing of this all-out kind of blaming of those darn duplicitous Austrians who led us into an ambush and led us defeat because they wanted to strike a better deal with Russia, with the French.
Right.
So for the Russians, Austerlitz is a blip. It's just a setback that maybe we'll fix it.
Okay.
Now, when the Friedland takes place in 1807, that's where they're like, all right, yeah, this is the first time we really got our ass gonna handed to us, but we'll learn from it.
Yeah.
And learn they did, because now they are winning against the Iranians in the war that starts in 1804. They're winning in the war that starts against the Turks in 1806. And they certainly won the war against Swedes. So then by the time we get to 1812, right, the perception is, well, over the last 100 years, we only lost 1.5 times. And even then, it's not our responsibility. Right?
Okay.
It's not our guilt.
I think that's a great frame of reference. And that kind of puts me in the mentality, especially of the Russian officer corps, that, I don't care if it's Napoleon or not, we're not going to lose. And
yeah. I think there is a wonderful quote in the memoir that I just translated, where it says, "The very word retreat was reprehensible for any Russian."
Right. So here we are in 1812, and sure enough, in June, July, and August, they're slowly retreating, and Napoleon wants to have the big set-piece battle, which de Tolly won't give him, until Napoleon's pushing into Russia. He's going through towns, and the populace is condemning de Tolly as this, coward, or he's in the pay of Napoleon. And this goes on for a while, right? Until Smolensk. Like, people are like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Exactly. And so, but think how unpopular this approach would be in a nation that is accustomed to victories, that has just celebrated victories over the Ottomans, victories over the Swedes, over the Poles. And now suddenly this Napoleon, this upstart, this heathen, right? Godless, emperor of the French, trying to defile the native, Russian soil. So unsurprisingly, there is a great animosity in the public and in the army. Barclay de Tolly, is character, as I mentioned, is not conducive to him liking. And then at Smolensk, he makes a series of mistakes. And this is where there's a kind of people who really like Barclay de Tolly, and they oftentimes ignore the mistakes that he has done. And I think some of the crucial mistakes that he makes are at Smolensk, where he meets with Bagration. And here we have a study of contrast in character. Whatever is Barclay de Tolly, diametrically opposite on him is Bagration.
Right.
This fiery general. But unlike Barclay de Tolly, Bagration embraced Russian identity. He was Orthodox. He was speaking Russian, broken, kind of not broken, but kind of heavy accented Russian, but nonetheless. And of course, he has this reputation that is unrivaled. He's the man who's led the assault on St. Gotthard Pass in 1799. He's the one who made that heroic stand at Hollabrunn in 1805 and saved the Russian army. He is the one who was the only one, really, the only Russian commander who emerged with his reputation intact at Austerlitz is Bagration.
Right.
He is the one who leads the assault against Bothnia, right? And so that's this striking guy, this dark complexion, large nose, larger than life. He's already kind of eulogized by the poets in Russia as Bagration. And it's a play on his name, which means the god of the army. I mean, how can compete? If you're Barclay, how do you compete with the god of the army?
No, that's
and Bagration is convinced in 1812 that the only way to confront Napoleon is through decisive battle.
Why is the city of Smolensk? I know it says it's a holy city, but why is it so important?
It is important because it is, as Kutuzov puts it, key to Moscow. It is essentially the last point on the way to Moscow where you can have a strong position to defend. In fact, when Smolensk falls and Kutuzov hears about it, he famously says the keys to Moscow is fallen. And then when he takes command of the army, we know that he spends a week searching for a good position. And ultimately, the only position he really can find is at that small village at Borodino. But even that is not a particularly strong position. So Smolensk is the place where you can do something about containing the invasion. But of course, Barclay de Tolly's hands are constrained because of opposition within the army. In fact, the opposition that is so vociferous that at one point a group of officers seriously thinks about removing him from power and giving the command to Bagration.
Right.
In my kind of writings, I refer to this as almost a mutiny of officers.
Right.
And so he needs to deal with that. He needs to deal with the numerical superiority of the French force, and of course, he needs to deal with Napoleon. I mean, we have to kind of admit that Napoleon has that larger-than-life reputation, right? And how do you confront the man who's been crushing everything in front of him for the past decade?
Right.
So, ultimately, and this is where Barclay is forced to agree to counteroffensive, but he does so half-heartedly. He refused to fully support it, and he does make mistakes. For example, he vacillates about which direction his army will go. He wastes 4 days in looking to the north because he thinks that's where the French are coming. Then he hears they are in the west. He shifts back. Then he's doubtful whether that was right, so he pushes back to the north. And all of this kind of creates this vision of an indecisive leader. So he gets this nickname, Barclay de Tolly, which means all bark and no bite.
Oh, no.
Play on his nickname. And then it saps his position in the army.
Yeah.
And in society. So even before the news of the fall of Smolensk reaches St. Petersburg, Emperor Alexander makes the decision to remove him from power. So I think that was already kind of decided, even no matter what would have happened at Smolensk.
Yeah, and it was a French victory, barely so. I mean, it could have been a more impressive one, but General, as you know, didn't cut the retreat line as he's supposed to. But it was, I mean, horrendous losses on both sides, right? Like 10,000 dead and wounded on each side.
Yes, it's a heavy battle, not least because Russians are holding position in the kind of behind the massive bastions and walls of Smolensk, and the French are attacking. There's a heavy artillery commitment on both sides. Smolensk is largely destroyed in this battle, so both sides suffered heavily. But as you pointed out, this opportunity that the French had to intercept and inflict, I don't think it would have been I don't think Napoleon would have been able to destroy the Russian armies even during the retreat, but he would have, at Valutina Gora, he had an opportunity to inflict further losses.
Yeah.
But even then, that was mismanaged, and Barclay de Tolly retreats along with Bagration all the way to a small town of Tsarevo Zaimiще, where in late August, Kutuzov arrives.
Okay.
And Kutuzov is smart enough to understand that, yes, for all the smack talk and for all the criticism that Barclay de Tolly was subjected to, the essence of his, I think, strategy was correct.
Right.
And so that is one of the crucial reasons why Kutuzov keeps Barclay around.
Yeah.
He is still commander-in-chief of First Western Army,
right?
While Kutuzov exercised the overall command.
And I think that takes a lot of humility to, like, all right, here comes Kutuzov. I'm basically being demoted.
Yes. In fact, at Borodino, we see his reputation really revive because everyone sees that he's everywhere. He loses several horses that are shot under him. He's almost every ADC that he had was either killed or wounded. So and that's because he was in the heat of action and they had to be next to him. So and Barclay, I think, kind of rescues his career by his almost complete sacrifice, right? Self-sacrifice in this battle.
Okay.
Borodino is again in the eye of the beholder, right?
Yeah.
I would say yes, it's French victory because they kept the battlefield, but considering the losses, it is a Pyrrhic one.
Horrific. Yeah, it is a Pyrrhic victory for sure.
In my biography of Kutuzov, I explain this kind of growing confrontation between Barclay and Kutuzov over how things are done, how things are run. And so ultimately Kutuzov makes a decision to sideline him. Partly kind of one of the reasons why this two commanders clash is because Kutuzov blames the fall of Moscow on Barclay.
Right.
Essentially, he says, well, if Barclay had defended Smolensk, we would not have had to fight Borodino, we would not have had to surrender Moscow. And Barclay is astonished by this claim because he knows that Kutuzov knows better than that.
Yeah. And it's good to have unified command. You don't want the guy who used to be in charge second guessing every decision you make as Kutuzov. So I get that.
Yeah.
Why I sidelined him.
The only good, the good thing that came out of this is that Barclay is so exasperated that he sits down and writes a long explanation of his actions, which effectively is his memoir of 1812, and we have it. So that's the thing. As a historian, I'm actually quite quite pleased.
Yeah. So from there, though, it looks like he's reemployed in 1813, and once Kutuzov dies in that year, he again becomes commander in chief in time for the Battle of Bautzen. Is that correct?
Not directly, right? So it goes again to show that there are still reservations about him. But you're right that as soon as kind of the war of the invasion of Russia is over, already in December of 1812, Alexander goes to Vilna, and with his arrival, he kind of takes over the command of the armies, and he begins to sideline Kutuzov because he has disagreements with which we've talked, I think, last time. And one of the kind of early signs of sidelining Kutuzov was Alexander's decision to recall Barclay de Tolly and Bennigsen. And so Barclay comes initially as the corps commander. When Kutuzov died in April of 1813, of course, the supreme command is given not to Barclay, but to Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein is receiving that because he is riding high. I mean, he has this reputation of the savior of St. Petersburg. He has this aura of great commander. And that aura is quickly disappears after Russian defeats at Lutzen and Bautzen. Napoleon makes a mistake of accepting the negotiations, right, with the Allies.
Correct.
And that's during those negotiations, Alexander makes a decision to give Barclay de Tolly the command of the army.
Right. And he performs well, it looks like, at Dresden, Kulm, and Leipzig.
I think so. But this is where maybe we should kind of qualify his success. He is commanding, right, the army, the combined forces within the larger army of Bohemia that is commanded by the Austrian field marshal. So I think there is always Barclay de Tolly operating within a larger coalition framework. And I don't think the success at Kulm or Leipzig could be entirely ascribed to him. Leipzig is a massive battle, and Barclay's army is a small part of it in a large mosaic. So I don't know how much of it we can kind of say that, hey, that's Barclay de Tolly. He drafted the plan. He did it. But he is a good manager. He's a good administrator. I don't think he's a good at, I don't think he has much of a role in shaping and crafting the overall strategy. But he's good at implementing it. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
The same applies for the campaign in France in 1814, right?
Yeah.
Barclay commands Russian forces, but he commands it within the larger coalition army, and he listens to the supreme commander, which is the Austrian Field Marshal Schwarzenberg. And of course, don't forget that Alexander, Emperor of Russia, is always present, always there to override or dictate whatever Barclay de Tolly decides.
Now that you've described him like that, he kind of reminds me of Marshal Davout with his aloofness and brusqueness, but also that he can implement plans and stick to whatever the overall strategy is.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's actually a good comparison and kind of flattering for both of them, right? For Davout and Barclay de Tolly.
Yeah.
They are both capable commanders. Now, Barclay de Tolly never fought a battle, or kind of independently, never fought a battle on this scale of our status. But his actions at Kuopio, at Hof, I think show tactical ability. He certainly has a good understanding of operational skill or craft. In 1812, he shows the ability to withdraw his army in the face of enveloping maneuvers of Napoleon. He does well in Finland against Swedes operationally. And again, in 1813, I think operationally he's quite successful, yes.
Okay. So jumping ahead to 1814, the invasion of France starts. And again, he's controlling the Russian contingent, not the entire Allied force. Schwarzenberg and Blucher are doing that. But it looks like he's involved in the taking of Paris, correct?
He was involved in the Battle for Paris. You're right. It's a successful battle, but I mean, look at the numbers engaged, right? Poor Marmont and Mortier and Moncey have barely 40,000, and the Allies have in around 100,000 troops. So I think by then the outcome of the battle is predetermined. It's the I wouldn't give much credit to Barclay de Tolly for the capture of Paris.
Right. But here's what is really impressive. This is what makes me kind of happy for de Tolly. He receives a baton for field marshal as a reward for helping to capture Paris. So if you think about where he was 18 months before, where he was basically fired and sent home by Kutuzov, and here you are basically 2 years later capturing Paris and becoming a field marshal. I just think that's a wonderful story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what makes me happy about this guy, anyone who is condemned to the degree that he was, anyone who is accused, there is this famous confrontation at Dorogobuj in 1812, where Russian Emperor's brother, Grand Duke Constantine, berates Barclay de Tolly in front of his troops, right, in public. And he tells him, and this is a quote, "You are damn German. You are a filthy sausage maker. You are a traitor and you are a scoundrel. You are doing nothing but selling out Russia."
Wow.
Right. I mean, that is an astonishing kind of invective against a commander-in-chief of the army.
Right.
And coming from the Grand Duke, there is so much, there's little Barclay can do to respond. But to be accused of kind of being the schmerz, that's the word that he uses, this filthy sausage maker, right?
Yeah.
What a kind of flinging of mud it is. And then, as you said, less than 2 years later. Right?
And this isn't just some guy off on his own. He had a family, he had a wife, he had kids. So it probably hurt, even though he's aloof and somewhat brusque, it probably hurt his feelings quite a bit that not only is the royal court making fun of you or chastising you, so is the general populace. Like peasants you walk by are saying, "Why are you retreating?"
Yeah. And you're right that he's subjected to this public pressure. Barclay never developed this support base within the Russian elite, partly because he was this relatively poor man. He doesn't even have kind of enough money to have a decent place to live in.
Right.
And that's by the standards of these grand Russian noble families.
Yeah.
And now to see him in 1814, not only elevated to the position of Field Marshal General, but also given the title of the Prince of the Russian Empire,
right,
to be in charge of the triumphing celebration that the Russians organized at the Parisian suburbs of Vertu in September of 1815, where 150,000 troops paraded to celebrate the victory over Napoleon, and Barclay is at the center of it all. What a feeling it must have been.
Yeah, and I'm happy that he got to experience that. But it seems like shortly after, though, his health began to fail.
And I think that can be said about many of the people who went through the hell that would have been those 2 years of almost nonstop
battle
campaigning.
Yeah.
So it's, Kutuzov dies shortly after 1812 because of his ill health. Doktorov, another kind of prominent general, kind of gets sick and dies shortly after the war ends. Barclay de Tolly's health gets really, hammered during the campaign, and he has barely time to recover after the war. He is sent to command the so-called First Army, which is in what is today kind of Belarus, but gets sick. He's allowed in 1818, in early 1818, to leave his command and travel to Germany to the resort towns to kind of recuperate.
Yeah.
But he dies traveling there at a small village just a few miles from Insterburg. And the Prussians actually, the Prussian king, upon hearing that he died, sent troops to organize a guard of honor, and then escorted his body back to Russia. And the body arrived in Riga in June. And there was a mass kind of commemoration service organized.
Yeah.
And he was buried at the family estate in Livland in 1818, next to his wife.
And relatively young, 56 years old. So let's, and I always like to wrap up with his legacy, and just, I guess, the legacy in terms of Russian generals and in the Napoleonic epic overall would be my question to you.
I think there is a legacy, of course, is that of one of the architects of the Russian victory of Napoleon in 1812, 1813. Yes, he's been vilified. He's been kind of acting under public pressure, but his ability to withstand all of it, to carry on convinced in the righteousness of his cause, plays a crucial role in Russian victory. I have no doubt that if Bagration commanded the Russian army, not even overall, but let's say if Bagration commanded the first Western army, the outcome of that war would have been very different. Because Bagration was far more aggressive, far more offensive-minded. And Barclay de Tolly's great credit is kind of successfully eluding the Napoleon's designs, leading the main army to the safety, and effectively passing the torch to Kutuzov. And of course, in 1813, whether he was the architect or just implementer of the strategy that was drafted by the Allies,
right?
He was there, and he played an important role in keeping the Russian army in the field. So I see his influence there. The sad thing, and kind of part of the legacy, is that that kind of the last few months of his life, where I think he was happy to receive the long overdue credit, didn't last. To start with, his name is largely overshadowed by Kutuzov. There is the national myth-making in place. Kutuzov takes all the credit. He's elevated into national institution. Barclay de Tolly, even on the more pragmatic level, during World War II, Barclay de Tolly's tomb, the graveside, will be destroyed. And of course, during the Soviet era, Barclay de Tolly once again was portrayed as a second fiddle to Kutuzov, right? And it is only in recent years, kind of more, I'm talking about last 30 years really, that you see a rehabilitation of his reputation, of who he was, taking place in Russia. You have great work coming out from the kind of quills of the likes of Viktor Tatvalushin, really fascinating Russian historian who's done a lot of research on rehabilitating Barclay de Tolly. But we have not done the same thing in the West. The only decent biography of Barclay is 40 years old and is written by Josselson back in 1980s. And that's reflective of research that the author done in the decade before. So really, that biography is 5 decades old. So we really need a fresh reassessment of it.
I was going to say, it sounds like your next book, Alexander.
No, I need a break.
No, I thank you for that. I think this was a great episode, just on a largely, I think, overlooked man. Like you were saying, Kutuzov gets all the credit. Suvorov is famously undefeated. So I think in terms of Russian generals, he doesn't get the notoriety that he should.
Yeah, and it is. I think this is a fascinating study on how nations kind of craft their history, how they choose national heroes. We know that it's not done by just the contributions and ability, right, alone. Here, Barclay de Tolly has done a lot to deserve his spot, and yet he's not being given that spot, at least not until recently.
Right.
But it's gonna opens the interesting pathways into discussing national history.
Well, thank you for that. That was very informative, and I really appreciate all the details on de Tolly. I hope my listeners did as well.
Thank you.